Hello, I'm David Tao, and welcome to the Theories of Everything program. Viewers, this is the second program in our two-part update series, State of the Planet, in which we review the major trends and indicators relating to the health of our planet in its capacity to support life, all forms of life, animal life, plant life, the biosphere at large. And in this first program in this series, we discovered some disturbing trends. These trends have been around for a long time, but particularly over the past year, the past 18 months, the indicators of the capacity of planet Earth to continue to support life at the level that we have become accustomed to since human beginnings of civilization around about 12,000 years ago have sharply deteriorated. And we realise now that only the best management, only radical management, only radical change can keep this planet and us alive in the future. Now that may sound rather dramatic, but the indicators are available now. There's a vast amount of environmental, biological research going on to measure whether the global warming effects, for example, are real and what the impacts of global warming are. In our first program, again, we looked at the myths that have now been curtailed relating to global warming. In other words, global warming is real because the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is at the highest level it's ever reached for over 400,000 years. So in between all the volcanic eruptions and all the changes in solar output and the variations in our orbit around the Sun, this continuous increase in carbon dioxide has been going on, and particularly over the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution. But even a long time before that, because a large amount of deforestation occurred, a large proportion of the natural habitat, particularly in Europe, was reduced. The forests were cleared to make for housing, for ships, for smelting of iron and steel and so forth. So there have been major changes to our planet going back a long way, and even back, you could say, as far as 40,000 years, because during that period it looks like early Aboriginal humans, early humans on this planet, eliminated a large proportion of the megafauna. There was again a decimation of these animals, so there was an abrupt change. It's the abruptness of change that's important here. We're going through an abrupt threshold of change now. 200 years is practically nothing in the scheme of things in the evolution of this planet. Already, though, we see disruption to climate. We see major flooding right across Europe. The latest, for example, just the other day in Brazil, huge heavy rainfalls, because when you get global warming, you get hydration of the land surfaces in a stronger pattern, which produces more droughts, but you get also much greater levels of water vapour in the atmosphere and therefore much heavier rainfall. So you naturally get more extreme events of flooding, storm surges, etc. So we have extreme events whose frequency is increasing around about 9-10-fold at the moment, and will go up to around 30-fold if the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere keeps increasing. Now, beyond that, we have biodiversity degradation. As I mentioned, 25% of animals and plants are likely to be gone within the next 50 years, which will lead to major ecosystem collapse. Most of the major top predators, both in the sea, for example, killer whales, white sharks, when they go, or when their numbers are drastically reduced, they have a major impact on most life beneath them, if you like. And at the opposite end, if you knock out the plankton at the very bottom chain of life, you have a major effect all the way up the chain, right through to us. But in between, you get myriads of plants and animals that have equally quite dramatic effects sometimes on life in general. such as frogs, for example, such as small mammals, such as lizards, such as snakes, such as medium-level predators, such as foxes. You have this chain of life, this web of life, is a more accurate way of describing it, that if it's disrupted through an abnormal threshold very quickly, it has to reform, it collapses. All the intricate webs start to collapse. Quite often the webs are robust, so that if you take out a small proportion, if a small proportion of these animals or plants lose their habitats or cannot cope with the increased warming or increased flooding events or whatever, they can recover. But if you take out major ones too frequently, then they don't have time to recover. You also get all sorts of changes in that web of life. You have different sorts of non-native animals and plant species coming in, and they often have huge events, such as the cane toad in our Kakadu, in our northern Australian area, for example. Hyacinths of various types in our waterways, carp, for example, in our waterways. But this is occurring all over the world. So it's very indeterminate, it's very uncertain what the outcomes will be, but we know the outcomes are not good, because when we look around us we see these unnatural events, unnatural climate patterns occurring, and you cannot, if that's the case, you cannot plan agriculture adequately. You don't really know how to cope with systemic change so rapidly. When you have introduced, as we have, massive monocultures on this planet, we've taken out vast swathes of natural forests, ecosystems in general, and endangered other ecosystems such as reefs. When you change those for high biodiversity to low biodiversity, and you plant vast swathes of coffee and tea and all the other monocrops, canola, and introduce new grazing animals across vast swathes of land, then naturally you'll get a range of different pests coming in, taking advantage of those monocultures, and there won't be the robustness, the diversity to be able to cope with them. So viewers, the crisis is real, and more importantly, there's only a limited window of opportunity to seize control of it and get it under control. And one of the first attempts to do that was through the Kyoto Protocol. As I mentioned previously, this aims to reduce carbon emissions by between 6 and 12% over the next decade or so. And it's done through a carbon trading process, where those who overproduce carbon dioxide can trade with those who underproduced. So there's a benefit, but there's also an overall reduction reached. Now, this is not meant to be a perfect process. Those countries outside the protocol, like the US and Australia, are saying it's not good enough, it's not perfect, it doesn't take into account developing countries who are just starting to come into this carbon cycle. But regardless, it's a process, it's a starting point, and always these things evolve. You've got to start somewhere. So there's no real excuse for not being involved. It's a world cooperative effort, and again, such issues of climate change and survival of the planet have to be tackled on a global basis. There's no room to say we'll do this and you can do that. Now, all the myriad different variables involved in relation to climate change, the health of the earth, revolve primarily around human populations, and that means it revolves to a large extent around feeding people, food security, if you like. And the population is increasing. It will increase by another 50% over the next 50 years, and there's probably no way of really stopping that. We can level that out. So the aim is to level the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but also reduce the impact of this increase in population, this increase in land usage as well that goes with it, because we've already used up about 1.5 billion hectares of land on the earth for agriculture, since agriculture began, again around very small start around 12,000 years ago in the major river deltas. But there's another 10% needed to cope with this increase of 50% in population. The other 40% is made up by more intense farming, better farming techniques, better agricultural techniques, perhaps increasing yields through genetic modification. We'll come back to that issue in another program at a future time. But whether it's through traditional techniques of plant breeding, or whether it's through faster techniques like genetic modification to reduce the dependence on herbicides and so forth, that's not the point. The point is that that land will have to be found somewhere, that extra 1.5 million hectares, and it will come from the most biodiverse areas on the planet. It will come mainly from areas of the Republic of Congo, the Zaire Basin in Africa, and Amazonia, Brazil and Argentina and Bolivia, Colombia in South America. So those wonderful carbon sinks, the massive natural forests that act as buffers, absorb a lot of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, will be very, very fragmented in another 50 years and won't be able to fulfill their proper functions. So that will be another driving force on the warming of the planet and the corruption of all its species. And when we get into those forests, we get into some very, very special animals indeed. I've already mentioned that the major predators on land, lions, tigers, cheetahs, all those predators are crashing in numbers by about 90% at the moment. But what's much more, or equally and perhaps much more significantly alarming, is the crash in the numbers of major primates, gorillas, orangutans, etc. Now, this is alarming for a number of reasons. One, again, it affects all ecosystems, but secondly, these are our closest relatives, and only by understanding them, living with them, in fact, in the future, can we understand really our own origins. This gives us a window into our past. Remember, humans split, early hominids split from primates about 7 million years ago. It's a long time to resurrect what actually happened through fossil evidence alone. To be able to study the living creatures, to be able to communicate with them, in fact, and see physically where our origins were. Under Darwin's great theory of evolution, that is absolutely, there's no other way that you can achieve that, and it's of the utmost criticality to retain that link. So if we start destroying the primates' habitats in those deep forests, then we lose a tremendous amount more than just losing another few species. So, linked of course to food security and the amount of food that's available, the type of food, and cereal production has to go up by another 50%, animal production by 90% over the next 30 or 40 years to sustain the population growths. Along with that particular problem of how to reach that level of sustainability and retain biodiversity, we have other problems of malnutrition. Infant mortality and malnutrition is extremely high in Asia and Africa, as we all know. It's around about 25%, or a billion people on this planet are malnourished, and a large proportion of those are children, and very young children. So there have to be better techniques in those countries to leapfrog the problems that have occurred and brought about largely to a large extent by the technologies of pollution. For example, there has to be much safer drinking water now. There must be ways of handling sewage better, sewage disposal. Immunisation and public health will be vital in these areas. But also, really, really importantly, will be education. Just the ability to improve the quality of life through better education. There's a direct link here with women's education. because it's understood that where you have women who've only had perhaps 4 years education in some of these countries, the level of infant malnutrition is about 25%. Where they've had some primary education or got through past to the top level of primary level, the malnutrition level is 15%. This direct link goes on. Where they've had any sort of secondary education, the level of malnutrition, infant malnutrition, drops to 3%. In other words, through better education, they can make a better life for themselves and their families and their children. And of course this ripples on. Child malnutrition leads to not only stunted physical growth but brain development as well. You don't have as high a quality of mental abilities in children that have been starved. And that ripples right through their life, through their generation. So you don't have quality and productivity of output from that population to again leapfrog and improve the quality of life. So food and water quality and the ability to reduce malnutrition, particularly through education and also of course through government programs like better road infrastructure. In China and India, building of roads has been one of the most significant, important factors in raising standards of living for farming communities. They've been able to get their produce to market quicker and easier. They've been able to get their children to schools far more easily. The cost of marketing has gone down, and again all that leads to poverty alleviation, reduction in poverty, and improvement again in standards of living. Viewers, we've seen over these last two programs that there is a consensus by scientists, most scientists at least, working in the ecological sciences, environmental sciences, earth sciences, that radical change is required if we're going to survive, and certainly if our lifestyle is going to be commensurate with our wishes, with our aspirations, with our children's aspirations, most particularly, and their children. So the good news, I guess, is that there's already moves afoot. Not only the Kyoto Protocol, which is still hanging in the balance, but the UK, for example, has taken a lead. It's demanded of its industry that there be a reduction in emissions of 16% within the next 10 years. It's demanded this of its power stations, its oil refineries, its cement factories, metals factories, whatever. And most importantly, the European Union is doing the same thing. It's demanded a drop of 8% per decade ongoing in carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases. So that's a very important first step. And the other very beneficial thing, the very optimistic scenario, is that there is now global cooperation on a large scale, hopefully soon through global protocols such as Kyoto and the United Nations framework for climate change control, but also amongst individuals and businesses and governments and scientists right across the planet. The reason this is happening, is because of increasing awareness, basically. There is a growing awareness, and the awareness comes through these extreme events. It focuses the attention very quickly when you have extreme disruptions to normal weather patterns, so that your farm output drops by 50%. Your urban infrastructure is affected by floods, by heavy rainfalls, by extreme cold, as happened in New York. When the ice sheet starts melting and the tundra starts melting, and the polar bears and the caribou are affected, and even the butterflies that normally nest down from Canada into Mexico, the monarch butterfly population has recently crashed because the weather has changed in their normal nesting area, in their normal migration area down in Mexico. This very quickly focuses the mind of everyone. So when we have major, for example, disease impacts which follow on from these climatic changes quite often, such as the bird flu and the possibility of crossover between bird and human influenza pathogens. You get a global cooperative effort to solve it. You get capacity to sequence these pathogens and to work out preventative action. All this is very important. I mean, disease is a major impact of climate change. 300 million cases of malaria a year, 3 million of which cause death. 100 million cases of dengue fever. This focuses the mind of countries, of both the developing, where it mainly occurs, and the developed countries, because they bear the impact as well. And viewers, it's very interesting with hindsight to look at how we got into this predicament in the first place, how humans arrived at this particular point in time where we're struggling for survival, literally struggling to survive. It's interesting because it's been a logical trial and error process. Early humans grew crops. They felled areas to grow those crops. They also felled other areas to build, to use the timber to build ships to explore the rest of the earth. They developed tools and techniques. They smelted iron and steel eventually, so they'd have better tools and better armaments. Eventually, this led to the discovery of new forms of energy. Steam power, for example. Every civilization similar to ours will go through a similar process because it's a logical one. Early humans learnt that they couldn't just kill as many animals or clear as much of the forest as they wanted. They very quickly learnt there was a rebound effect. They'd have, if they killed all the animals, if they didn't conserve their habitats, then they wouldn't have enough to eat. So they had to go through that learning process. All Aboriginal peoples went through that same process. After killing off the major megafauna, they then learned to conserve it. But then modern humans had to learn the process all over again. Having achieved control over basic tasks through new forms of energy, through water power, through wind power, and then later through steam power and electric power. They learnt that this takes its toll too. It produces pollution, inevitably. You can't have those forms of power without going through that pollution stage. You can't have factories without generating pollution in the early phases. So again, they had to learn. And then they discovered nuclear power. And nuclear power, of course, almost saw the end of the planet, and could still do so. So this is a trial and error process, and it's an ongoing trial and error process, and we're having to learn very quickly, and we've been on a knife edge for a long time. All civilizations, probably through the universe, will go through that same learning curve. Some will survive and some will not. Let's hope we are one of the ones that do survive and do learn quickly enough so that our future generations, our children and our children's children will live to see the wonders of this universe. I'm David Tao, and you've been watching the Theories of Everything program. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week.